Hey guys, welcome to session number 4 of the Trailer Music Composers Podcast. Let's dive in. One man, one microphone, and a worrying obsession with string risers. Welcome to the Trailer Music Composers Podcast. Okay, today in this session, I wanted to cover common mistakes of aspiring trailer music composers. So I obviously encounter quite a lot of aspiring composers through my trailer music school and through my online courses. So I feel like I'm getting to know the common mistakes that they make, and I start to hear it when people submit demos to me as well, And the reason I'm bringing this up now in here is because I want to give you guys a heads up to make sure that you're not making those same mistakes, and I'm not saying that I am free from mistakes, I am by no means free from mistakes, and I even make these same mistakes myself. So maybe it's even a courteous reminder to myself to deliver my music in the best way possible. So I've managed to kind of break it down to 5 common mistakes, because I feel like I see these 5 so many times. And I myself did some of these mistakes a great deal, and I still do. But I feel like, having now experienced hearing so many other composers work, I feel like I'm starting to get to grips with these mistakes. Now, some of these are just mistakes that you make just because you're so excited about the music that you've written, and also because a lot of us, I'm speaking for myself here, but I also know that a lot of my students come from a rock music background, or a pop music background. And when I say pop, I mean popular. I don't mean pop as in the genre pop. So within that genre, all those genres, I should say, we get used to a certain way of delivering ideas, and we try and take that way of delivering an idea and put it onto trailer music, and it doesn't work in the same way. And I'll get into that when I get into each point. So, 5 common mistakes. Now, I'm going to work backwards here and leave the most common mistake until last, because it's my favorite one as well, because I feel like the last one is often hiding a certain insecurity or fear. Anyway, so let's get started. My 5th, number 5 on the common mistakes list, is too many drop downs in the queue. Now, the effect that has on your trailer music queue is it loses pace. Now, those composers who are veterans of the industry will understand how much of a killer to your track losing pace is. And I don't mean that your track has to be pacey for it to lose pace. I mean that once you've set up a pace in your track, you have to be careful that your drop downs do not stop that from flowing. And if you do stop it from flowing, it's amazing how quickly the listener loses interest, and that listener is a potential buyer of your cue, an editor, a supervisor, producer, director, whatever. If it loses pace, they go, oh, okay, it's lost it, done, switch over to the next one. So you have to really be careful about the way you use your drop downs. And if you're using a drop down, you sit back, listen to it, and think to yourself, am I just putting a drop down here because I want the editor to have a place to edit, or am I putting a drop down here because it has a musical purpose? So you often have a drop down at the end of Act 1, at the end of Act 2, and the end of Act 3, because it has a musical purpose of a paragraph of at the end of the paragraph. It's the end of the act. Drop down, take a breath, into the next act. Drop down, take a breath, into the next act. But when you do those drop downs, you will notice the masters of the drop down will not lose pace. They will have reverse sound effects coming in, perhaps even maintaining some percussive or driven element within the drop down. But there will be something that if it does stop the pace, it gives you an idea that the pace is going to return. And that's what the reverse sound effects, the swish hits, they do. They kind of say, hey, something's coming, pay attention. And that's part of our job as trailer composers, is to indicate what is to come in our music. And that's why we all love risers. Well, specifically me, I absolutely love a riser, because it can take a mediocre sounding idea and just all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, this is a trailer cue, this is so cool, I'm the best. And it's great. So I would say limit your drop downs to 3. At the most, limit them to 3. If you have a musical reason for doing more than 3, by all means, chuck them in there. But don't just put them in there for the sake of it. You don't have to have a drop down at the end of Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. You can just slide straight into the next act seamlessly, and the editor will cut to that drop in the stems. Okay, so just be wary of that. Am I using a drop down just for the sake of it, or does it serve a musical purpose? Right, now, number 4 is using drag and drop samples too often. Now, when I'm talking about drag and drop samples, I'm talking about those, Keep Forest style, trailer music instrument style drag and drop samples, where you can take a boom, just lay it on your track, which is great, and I love it. I love the fact that there's this whole sort of niche trailer musician sample library thing growing. And it's great for us because it means that there's more awareness of the role, but also it means we've got more toys to play with. Now, the problem comes when you use those drag and drop samples, i.e. a single sample throughout the entire track. Now that isn't that much of a problem if you created it yourself, or if you manipulated it throughout the track so that it evolved. But quite often people would take the sample and just plop it on their track at 16 bar intervals. So right from the get-go, you hear this huge boom, which you're like, yes, that's epic. But then after like the 32nd time you've heard it, you're a bit like, okay, I'm a bit bored of that. And it's not like that amazing siren thing that was recorded in the first Alien trailer. It's the sound that you've heard before, because obviously it's a sample that other people have bought and other people are using. It's like when you hear those Omnisphere patches on TV. I always hear a couple of the Omnisphere patches I use when I'm watching TV shows. I'm like, that guy's got Omnisphere. Or girl, whoever the composer is, has Omnisphere. Anyway, the problem is the track then loses impact and feels repetitive. So the impact of that massive boom that you've paid for when you sign up to, those sample library companies and get those great libraries is reduced because you use it at its full capacity right from the get-go. So, it opens with boom, full spectrum, down from sort of bow busting below 20 up to ear piercing 20,000 K. It's the whole spectrum, and you think, oh my goodness, I've just pooed myself. That was immense. This trailer cue is going to be epic. And then hear it again and again and again and again, and it takes the focus away from the rest of the cue because all you can hear is this single sound. Obviously, the same sound over and over and over again. Now, my remedy for that is that you don't use the same sample right from the get-go. Maybe introduce the sample piecemeal. So maybe you don't open the track with it. You plop it on the beginning of Act 2. Wow, this is amazing, Act 2. And then maybe halfway through Act 2, and then in Act 3, it's more regular. Or say something, you use it like a simple trick of you have it in the same way that you have it placed, which is every 16 bars right from the get-go. Cool. But you put something on it like even a high-pass filter, and you gradually automate the frequency so that it starts off as like a tinny thing, or it starts off as a sub-rumble, however you want to start it, but then it gradually opens up and you can feel this sound getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, like a filter sweep in dance music. It gives this sample a journey, and that's what you're trying to do. You're telling a story with your tracks, and if you can't, if your story is just this same old like big farty poem, it's going to be a bit of a boring story. I am a huge fan of repetition, but you have to be clever with it. So when you're using those drag and drop samples, when I say drag and drop, I mean, they're like different poems mapped out on a keyboard. Just be careful the way you use them. Either use them sparingly or use them intelligently. Right, number 3, the third most common mistake, is making Act 3 the same as Act 2. And I don't mean they've done it on purpose. They've fallen into the trap of Act 2 and Act 3 basically feeling the same. And that usually stems from two things. Either they've made their second act too massive so that they don't really have anywhere to move in Act 3, or when it comes to Act 3, they don't know how to make it feel bigger. And the result is you get to Act 3 and you go, okay, I'm a bit bored now, this feels looped. And it does. The effect is the feeling of loops. And we're all using loops. Don't lie about it. We're all using loops. We're all thinking in 4 and 8 bar progressions. Maybe some intelligentsia out there will be thinking in a different way. Actually, I'm dealing with 4-part harmony and counterpoint rigid. Well, great. Well done for you. Well done you. There will still be loops. It's just the loops are different lengths. Anyway, I'm digressing, aren't I? Yes. So remedies. So say your Act 2 is too big. Strip it back. You can have an Act 2 that doesn't feel massive. The Act 2 just has to bring some pace, bring something new to the table. I remember in a film, Act 2 is when the proverbial hits the fan, when the problems start in the narrative. So it has to feel like it brings tension. And usually the easiest way to bring tension is to give it a pace. Because pace gives you this kind of like tension that you need to be moving because it's feeling like it's moving. And that's an easy way to add tension to represent that change in Act 2. So it doesn't have to be massive in Act 2. Or the way you do that, rather than stripping instruments out, is you look at your orchestration. Can I drop some instruments down an octave? Or lose some elements of the harmony, like, do I need that perfect fifth? It's not really doing anything for the harmony. Can I maybe just go for the seventh and the third if I'm working the seventh chords, or even just the third and the root, whatever it is? Think about that, and so that you can progress your harmony and progress your orchestration, so that when it does hit Act 3, that's when the real size is experienced. Now, the other thing is the worry. I mean, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. This was my issue when I started writing trailer music. Act 1, yes. Act 2, yes. Act 3, what do I do? There aren't many manuals that tell you how to produce an epic sounding track using sort of 60 to 100 channels and how to make it big sounding without muddying the waters. And that's one of the things. Usually it's just a case of knowing how to use your instruments. So for instance, I would always use brass in a kind of choral way in Act 3, which was totally wrong. The brass needs to feel kind of like a huge power chord strum in the third act. It needs to have this sort of massive impact. Those kind of like classic scenes where someone's got like a huge wall of Marshall stacks behind them and they sort of plug their guitar in and it's like, ooh, and then people's sort of skin gets melted off their face and their socks are flying off all over the shop. That's the type of thing that brass wants to do. And when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about the Brahms, really. You could still write in a choral way when it comes to your brass, but it needs to have a different approach to it as well. You then need to start thinking about your horns taking the top line. Obviously, when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about epic music rather than trailer music in general, because trailer music in general, it's just a case from genre to genre, your approach to the third act will differ. But the most important thing is impact. Impact can come from lots of different things. It doesn't have to come from a huge wall of sound. It can come from a tempo change. It can come from an orchestration change. It can come from a drop into a completely lower level of dynamic. So you just need to think about your cue, about the genre you're working with, and how you can make Act 3 the same. If you really don't know how to make Act 3 bigger, make Act 2 smaller. Job done. Right, now, Act 2. Wait, I've too many acts here. Common mistake number 2 is using your full drum rhythm too early. Now, this is something that I learned from Steve Reich. Reich? I've always said Reich. I'll say Reich. Steve Reich. When he would have like a drum pattern in his mind, and he would strip out the parts so that when it starts, the drum part starts with one hit. And then as the drum progresses, he adds another hit. So it becomes two hits within the pattern, and then you progress to get to your full drum pattern. Now, what a lot of aspiring composers do when they submit a demo is they want to give Act 2 impact, so they load it with everything. And it's great because it does have impact, but then again, it's the same problem. I get bored. Okay, I've heard the same drum rhythm with all the same iterations already. I'm only halfway through Act 2, so by the time I get to Act 3 and it's the same drum rhythm again, I'm not interested. I've lost interest. Same thing applies as the previous mistake. If you feel like you've got your biggest sounding drum pattern, I'll say pattern, then put that at the back end of Act 3 and then work backwards from there. I know some people mix their trailer cues like this. They mix from Act 3 and work backwards. Because once you've got Act 3, you know the scope of your cue, both its size, its weight, its impact, its pace, its drama, its emotion. You know everything from Act 3 because that's essentially all you're doing. You're building up to that point. So you have your full thing there and you work backwards. And what I would do if I were you, if you're not sure what I mean, is I would take your drum pattern and then loop it backwards right to the start. And at each reiteration of the pattern, take a note out. So the first reiteration you lose a note, second reiteration you lose 2 notes, third reiteration lose 3 notes, etc. And when I say notes, that can take the form of literally a note within the rhythm if it's a single drum, or it can be maybe even a drum that is playing. So actually I'll lose the snares. I won't have the snares until the end. Oh, actually here I'll lose the taikos, and here I'll lose the ticking clock. Use it. And then you'll see that your rhythm is progressing and you're giving your idea breadth simply by spreading the love. Right, now, this first one, I am extremely passionate about introductions. Extremely passionate about them. Introductions set the scene. They are the things that capture you. When I sit down to watch a trailer, and I have to say I have very little patience with a lot of trailers because I sit down and go, this again. Even when it's my music, it's this again, Rich. You're doing your cello plucks again. But what you're doing with your introduction is you're grabbing their attention. You are the hook into the trailer. You are the hook into the world. You are the hook into the soundscape. So what you do in your introduction gives them an idea of what is to come. Now, the mistake that everyone makes is overcomplicating the introduction. And I know why, because I have done it too. And it's for fear that a single note in an introduction isn't enough. Well, no, I can't have that single piano note. That doesn't... No, they won't like that. Let's put some drones in. Let's put a cinematic boom. Let's layer up at least 6 different instruments playing the same note so that I have this wonderful layer, which admittedly can sound very nice. But what happens is you start to add more layers, add more things, and before you realize it, you have thrown all of your interesting elements into the introduction. So again, you have nowhere to go with your patterns and nowhere to go with your dynamics. If you start with a single note, you have everywhere to go. You give yourself scope to move. It's kind of like if you imagine your introduction being a wall, let's rephrase that. Your introduction being some bricks, right? You can choose to make steps so that your listener can walk up those steps, or you can choose to make a wall so that they have nowhere to go. And what you want to do is tease them with little steps, little things, one by one, that gradually tease them into Act 2, tease them into Act 3, tease them into then going to see the film because that trailer was effing amazing. That's the thing. Don't overcomplicate your intro. A drone, when done well, can do the job. Think how many trailers start with violin harmonics. Think how many trailers start with a single ding or a single. Because those single sounds have been thought about and placed well, they create a visual landscape and a sonic landscape immediately. You hear that kind of like ding with a really lovely long reverb tail, and immediately you're in a different world. You know, you hear that harmonic, the nice violin harmonic doubled in the octaves, and you think, oh yeah, immediately I'm in the films. I'm in a film, and you hear it, and it's great. It just teases you in, and then once you're into that landscape, you're into that soundscape. That's when you bring in more elements. You're gradually revealing elements of your cue to them. You know, your cue could essentially be a 4-bar loop. But you have written it so cleverly that they don't hear that full 4-bar loop until right at the very end. At that point, they're like, this track is immense. Yep. Do you get me? So, don't overcomplicate your intro. So next time you sit down, try and do something simple. Like, try and refrain from adding more than 2 things, more than 1 thing perhaps. You will be surprised as to how it then affects the way you write the rest of the cue. It gives you more room to skirt, more room to develop. What you will find is your Act 2 will then develop more naturally, and your Act 3 will then feel bigger because you've started smaller. Now remember, with dynamics, both in visual mediums and in sonic mediums, dynamics come from a spectrum. If everything is forking loud, you're not going to hear it as forking loud. You're going to hear it as just loud, just one level. If most of your cue is quiet, but then it comes in with this huge sound, that huge sound is going to seem like a tidal wave of noise. It's really important. The same with drawing. If you're drawing, make sure that if you're doing dark shadows, make those shadows as dark as possible. That will then, by contrast, make the highlights stand out. And that's what you're doing with this. And a lot of these mistakes are very, very similar. You know, the same sample too often. Act 2 and Act 3 feeling the same. Full drum loops and patterns too early, overcomplicating the intro. Those 4 mistakes are all essentially the same thing. You're blowing your load too early. You're revealing your cards when you don't need to. Approach your music with confidence. You know what you're doing, because you're writing music that you like to write. No one else can do what you do. That's the thing to think about. You know what you're doing. Now slowly reveal your ideas. Believe me, it will help your writing no end. Now I just want to say thank you so much for taking your time to listen to this. I really, really do appreciate it. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe, please review, leave a review, that is. And if you want to learn more about writing trailer music, head on over to the Trailer Music School, and you can check out my YouTube channel as well. That's Richard Schreiber. Thank you so much, guys. You are awesome.